Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is refining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with the world's most innovative techniques, so you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds.
For me, I guess too, like with Clarinet, the concept is, although it is an interview show, it's also just like, I view it as kind of a conversation between clarinetists, right? So I am interviewing them, but it's almost as if like we went out for a beer to talk about the topic, like we just have a real conversation.
Hi, I'm Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 87 of the Clarinet Podcast, the show where I discuss all that's new and neat with clarinet, with the neatest people in the industry. On today's episode of the show, I have sort of a special conversation or discussion, I guess, that happened at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I was invited to speak for a podcasting class that's run by a woman named Meg Wilcox, who is a journalist and instructor with Mount Royal's journalism program. She's running, I think it's the first class of its kind at the university for podcasting specifically. There was 5 to 7 students in this group, sort of a small round table, intimate setting, and they all had to prepare a question for me, and they all had to listen to an episode of the Clarinet Podcast. So here we are spreading the love for clarinet even outside of the clarinet community, which is just wonderful. And I really want to thank Meg for having me out for this occasion. It was just a lot of fun. Let's move on to today's episode. This is a conversation, again, at Mount Royal University with Meg Wilcox.
Sean, I guess the first question is, what made you want to start a podcast?
Yeah, so for me, the idea of a podcast always was something I was interested in because I like listening to podcasts, right? And I was driving around a lot for what I do for work, and every once in a while I would check in. I did my degree in clarinet performance and was freelancing around the city and playing various things, teaching various things. A lot of driving. So I was always listening to podcasts, but I started to get tired of the ones I was listening to and wanted something more clarinet-oriented. But I could never find one, and so I would check for several months. Every once in a while, I would just sort of check in on iTunes, and there never was anything. And one day, I was chatting with my repair person for about an hour. Like we just got going about all sorts of really random stuff related to the clarinet. And I suddenly realized, like, oh, wait a minute, this would be exactly the kind of conversation I would want to listen to. And I bet there's other people out there like me that are kind of at this point in their career or are in college or some stage of their clarinet development that would find this really interesting. And so I just kind of started. I got my mic and made a couple phone calls, and Peter was one of the first people in the first season that I had on, and that's my repair person. Went out to his house actually in Penticton and did that interview. It was really fun, but yeah, so it just kind of got started out of need, which I think is a really good reason to start a podcast, especially if it's a niche that's not been filled yet, and you think there might be people that can fill it.
So you mentioned just picking up a mic and starting. How did you actually go about your first episode or starting the podcast?
Honestly, it started by accident because I I had started a Facebook page. I just called it the Clarinet Podcast and was kind of screwing around making it. And I didn't realize it was public, and people started following it. And I was like, all right, I better make a podcast now. And so I did like a demo podcast just at home. I recorded this little short 5-minute like intro because that was advisable at the time to do that. I don't know if it has any real benefit, to be honest, but it was sort of just an intro of what was to come. And I hadn't actually recorded any of it yet, so it was kind of a risk, I suppose. But I mentioned 4 guests I was going to be having on and talked about what it was and said, check back in a month here, there'll be a podcast here. And then I spent the next couple of weeks putting together material. And so that was in December 2015, and then in December 2018, 16. It started because I'd recorded and talked to the guests and edited and gotten it on iTunes and all these various different things.
So when you picked up your microphone and decided what your first episode was going to be, how did you decide that, and what was that first episode?
Well, clarinet was the concept idea was what's new and neat for clarinet, because there is no Entertainment Tonight that wants to have on like big clarinet artists or,
For shame.
you know, no one else besides me and very few others care about, you know, the launch of the next, you know, exciting barrel product or whatever. Like, it seems ridiculous almost, right? But there was nothing like that. So I wanted to feature artists and products and manufacturers and anything just sort of under the umbrella of clarinet, right? So the first interview was actually a guy named Ryan Pereira, who has a 3D printing company for clarinet accessories. So that was really cool. But since that, we became friends, and I met him at a couple clarinet conferences and things like that, and it's been pretty interesting. But yeah, I've had everybody on now that really I ever could dream of having. It's been pretty great, and from there, just sort of snowballed into different topics and ideas and episode styles and things like that.
So what would you say was one of the biggest challenges in starting your podcast? What were some of the things that stuck out for you being really difficult?
Definitely the technical aspects. I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't realize how many things went into it. Like, that's why it's so great to have a class like this, you know. I mean, I had to learn, you know, I unfortunately learned by doing. So it's not that that's unfortunate, really, but what I would suggest definitely is, like, I would say do 5 or 6, 7, 8 episodes, get them kind of in the can, listen back and go, well, what's working, what's not? And then maybe even redo one or change the formatting or something. If you just start and release, you sort of learn what's going well on the way, and what's going not is kind of stuck there now, you know? So, like, I knew nothing about editing and I don't know, nothing, but not enough to really do it properly. So, but there was a lot of time spent watching YouTube videos and contacting people and reading books. I got like 6 books from Amazon about interviewing and NPR broadcasting and all sorts of different stuff. I think that one you have sound.
Oh, yeah.
Sound Solutions, or whatever it's
oh,
called.
Gosh. Sound
NPR.
Reporting.
Sound Reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one was pretty good. The best one I read was by Martin Perlich. It's called The Art of the Interview. And that one was really good. And I watched some of his interviews. And I started listening, actually, to interviews and trying to determine what was happening in more of that sense from the perspective of the interviewer, too. So the technical side was difficult. And also the, like, what I would call the performance side was difficult. Because I didn't really think about it that way at first. I was just talking at a microphone, and I didn't realize I had to project, speak clearly, you know. To me, at first, I was sort of just whispering, talking to this microphone in my basement, like there's no one else around. Why would I talk loudly, you know? Like, it was sort of, so listening back is kind of awkward. I don't know if any of you listened to the first few episodes instead of the last few, but it's different to listen back to. It's totally different. The flow is different. The feel is different. Like, at that point, I felt like I was just conveying information. I didn't realize I needed to be there personality-wise for it. So yeah, it was a lot of stuff to learn. And honestly, if I'd known back then what I didn't know, I probably wouldn't even have gotten started.
Now everyone's face drops for a moment as they go, what have I done?
Oh no, yeah.
But you mentioned that you sort of learn as you go. Can you think of moments, like, how did you learn? Was there just a moment where you're listening, and after listening to a bunch of podcasts, you go, wait, that doesn't sound right anymore? Or did people give you feedback? How did you start to make those changes?
Yeah, some of it was feedback. I mean, there was one thing, you're probably trying to draw that story about the without further ado out of me.
I wasn't, but it's a good one. You can use it.
Yeah, so like there was this one instance where I'd released about 10 episodes, and finally this guy, I hadn't received any feedback, but I was getting quite a few downloads, like, 100 and something per episode. I was like, well, someone's listening to this. I mean, I don't know where they are, what they're doing, but they're doing it, And so finally this guy sent me an email. He's like, look, every time you're about to introduce the guest, you always say, without further ado, I bring you, or whatever, and he's like, I hate that phrase. And I was like, and at first I was like, man, that's so rude. I can't believe someone would write this in and have received nothing nice, but now there's this, like, this is like, at first I was like, But then I was like, wait a minute, this is awesome. It means he's listened to all 10 episodes. Like, that's pretty cool. And so I just replied and said, okay, like, what would you like me to say? What should I say? What would be better? And I think looking back, that's a huge moment, because like that, you have to be willing to kind of adapt and change and take good advice, not get so personally offended about everything, even if it is kind of offensive. I mean, it's true, and I hate that phrase too, so I don't know why I was saying it. So it just made me be a little more mindful about what I was saying and being exactly the same every single episode, and trying to have a bit different flow and better conversation. And I think a big thing is just trying to understand that you can find the solutions to a lot of things. Like, they might seem complicated, but I mean, we're not going to the moon, right? It's a lot of it can be found out if you just look for the answers,
Mm-hmm. So, as you're working on your podcast, you mentioned you have about 10 episodes out. You know, people are sort of listening. You mentioned the 170-ish downloads per episode. And then, with the exception of Without Further Ado Guy, how do you start to realize that people are listening and engaging, and you start to realize there's a bit of a community behind this?
It's a good question. I guess for me, the first time I really realized I'd made an impact or change, or there was a community around it. Like, I know I had a Facebook following, and I know there were people commenting and on the Facebook posts and stuff like that, Facebook posts. But the first time I realized it was something more interesting than maybe I thought was I went down to Clarinet Fest in 2016 in Kansas. I had taken a bunch of cards like this with me to give out to people, and was walking around trying to advertise the podcast. And I was also at that point sponsored by D'Addario, which is a large reed company, and they had put this stuff in their booth. And so, but I went around trying to give these cards to people, and people would get the card and they'd be like, "Oh, I already know about this, thanks." And I was like, first I was getting kind of frustrated. I was like, "Oh, this is annoying. I can't find anyone to give these to who hasn't already heard about it." And then I was like, well, wait a second. And one lady was actually listening to it when I walked up to her. She's like, "Oh yeah, you're Sean. I'm listening to this right now."
Wait, like, so you walked up to a woman in Kansas at a clarinet festival
was on her
while
phone,
she was listening to your clarinet-based podcast?
Yeah, it was bizarre.
Meta.
I know, but I was frustrated at first, and then I realized, like, wait a second, like everyone here knows who I am. This is bizarre, or at least what it is, you know. So that'd been about 6 months into it, because that was in June or July. And I started it in January, and that was just kind of like a, whoa, that's sort of interesting, you know? And the second Clarinet Fest I went to was to the point where people like wanted pictures and knew who I was, like just, it was really kind of bizarre actually. But yeah, it was interesting because I didn't know that there was that sort of following or discussion. And, you know, I don't really do this very much, but if I follow any of the clarinet bulletin boards and stuff that are out there, oftentimes people will post a reference to one of the episodes or discuss it or say, "Oh, I found this out from Sean's show," or whatever. And I don't know, it's interesting because you don't, when you're podcasting, you're just in your basement. Like, there's not even a job to go to for the day. It's not like a journalist working at a radio station where you have an office and a little, you know, colleagues and things like that. It's just kind of
fewer colleagues these days. But
yeah, I guess. It seems sort of like lonely almost. It's like just down in your basement. You don't realize the impact that can potentially happen from it. So, but yeah, that was.
Well, and that sort of leads to my next question, which is, why do you think the podcast has been so successful?
I'm brilliant. No, I was kidding. No, I think it's because there was a need for it. Like, I think that there's more people like me out there who wanted to listen to this, you know? And I think that it's actually, as weird as it sounds, like it's sort of to my benefit that I'm not a huge name symphony player or something. I'm just a normal guy who plays clarinet and am interested in it. And I know I have my fair share of work that I do with it, but I wasn't well known, you know? And I think that a lot of people, it resonates with them because they're in that boat too. And they can relate to me. And actually that's what happens too at these festivals is people come up and feel like they know me. And I feel bad because I don't, but it's just, that's what they feel, you know? So they've listened to 82 episodes or whatever, and there's a point where like you just kind of know somebody, you think, right? But unfortunately, it's I don't know them in return. But yeah, I'd say that's.
So if you think about those first episodes and where you are now, you know, about 70, 80-ish episodes now in, what would you say is the biggest change that's happened to the podcast?
I've really refined it. I say I've figured out more of the performance type stuff, like as far as talking, like you were talking about how the voice in radio is in kind of like almost your instrument kind of thing, and I hadn't thought about that, but it makes a lot of sense. Interestingly, I had not thought about it like that for the podcast, but I'd say just figuring out kind of the flow and the voice and what it should sound like, and even little things like where to put the housekeeping in the episode. I started out by putting it at the top of the episode, but it was advised to me by those people from the podcast review show or whatever to put it at the end of the episode because that's where the true fans are. The ones who don't care about the housekeeping are going to skip it anyways. And if someone's listened to your whole show, they're going to listen to the housekeeping. But if they haven't listened to the whole show, just put it at the end so they can just enjoy the show and get to the show, you know? And that, for me, it felt way more comfortable at that point, too. It was like, oh, this is better, you know? Mm-hmm. So just, I think so much has changed. I could barely listen back to the other ones. I almost wanted to take them down, but there's just so much value left in them, you know. They're still good conversations, but yeah, things really improved as far as audio quality and, I mean, form, performance elements. I mean, everything I found has been almost like sculpted to be better.
Yeah, each
It's
episode
better.
is a better
Yeah,
iteration of what you're doing.
Yeah, and maybe not each episode, because sometimes it's just, the guest has a bad mic, or, it's one of the challenges of podcasting. There's no control over that stuff sometimes. But as a whole, like, it's moving towards a different, better kind of concept.
So in terms of the listenership of your show, how would you describe your listenership and numbers?
Yeah, I mean, that was something. So at the beginning, like, I don't know if you guys read all these books or listened to some of these podcating podcasts, getting all into that. But they always talk about, what's the word? Oh, your avatar, I think is what it is. Like, who is the exact person who this is meant for? And I always found that to be kind of limiting, but then I realized that it was really just meant for me. Like, it's people like me, right? So I just kind of looked at what I would want to hear about, So that's kind of what I did. I just sort of framed it around people who are sort of like me, and I've had to kind of expand it both ways, outwards. What I mean by that is, like, if someone says a term that I know I understand, I do generally ask the interviewee to just describe it if it's jargon or technical, because there could be a high school student listening, there could be someone in junior high even, there could be an older person who's taking up the instrument, and I have many of those actually that reach out to me, but they may not know, and I don't want them to feel left out, right? But I also go both ways. I mean, it has to stretch beyond my interests. I maybe am not that interested in klezmer, or I've never really played klezmer style, but many people do. So I've tried to kind of expand who I am to accommodate the show, but also reach to different levels of people who could be like me but aren't exactly like me. Numbers-wise, it's interesting because a lot of the podcasting shows and podcasting podcasts and podcasting books that become podcasts and everything, all these things, they always make it seem like you need to reach huge download numbers. And in my experience and the experience of the people who I know doing this, you don't necessarily have to do that. I mean, I would say that the best clarinet episodes, as far as download numbers, clarinet rather, are getting, I don't know, 5 to 7, 8,000 downloads, which is a lot, but it's not what they tell you need.
It's not serial, yeah.
Yeah, it's not serial. I mean, but the ones that are less than that, I mean, I found out, for example, that if a podcast gets, I think it's more than 350 downloads in the first 48 hours, it's like in the top 10 to 20% of all podcasts. So that gives you some real, like, kind of a wake-up call, I mean, if you're getting a couple hundred downloads in the first week, you're doing great, But yeah, I found now that I think some algorithms have changed in iTunes and stuff, so it fluctuates, but it'll be on average about, at this point, 6,000 to 10,000 downloads a month, and it's reaching 80, 90 countries now, which is pretty cool. I just don't think I don't think there is a huge base. How many people play clarinet and are also interested to listen to something like that? It takes a special kind of interest to bother with a show like this, right?
But that said, I mean, you say the numbers aren't amazing, right? They're not serial grade, but you have managed to secure sponsorship and funding through that. So maybe you could share a little bit about that and how that's worked out. Yeah,
so I mean, I reached out for the sponsorship really early because I just knew I was onto something, and I knew that there was value here to be had. And also I wanted some kind of financial backing for it because, like, honestly, I was really busy, and I wanted to be able to make sure I could do this without, like, extraordinary sacrifice, because it gets expensive when you start doing it properly, like buying a new microphone or computer or traveling or whatever, and not to mention the hosting fees and all this stuff, right? So yeah, I reached out to sponsors rather early, and they were really great about supporting the idea, and they still are. They're still on board after all these episodes, and it's been a good relationship as that. But I would scratch, if you're looking for sponsors, like, just, again, scratch all the rules away, because it's not about they'll say, oh, you can ask for, 0.3 cents per download or whatever. And maybe that's how it works. Maybe that's how it's supposed to work, but that's not how I made it work. I just was like, look, this is what it cost me to produce. Let's break even here and for a while, and then as we go on, we'll talk, and so I got a number that worked for me and worked for them, and it works.
And how early on did that start?
I think that started in month 3 or 4. So I'd had about a back catalog of, 12 or 16 episodes. I think they came in around episode 20. Yeah. But it was, and so that was a good thing to pursue. I think, strangely enough, I think it legitimizes the show because people listen and they go, oh, I know what D'Addario is. That's interesting. D'Addario sponsors this. Like, I'll listen, you know. But I think it also, in some ways, limits the guests I can have on because I'm not going to have on probably, I mean, it's never happened. I guess it could theoretically, but the direct competitor, I don't know why they would want to have their interview sandwiched between two ads for their biggest competition. Like, if it was me, I probably wouldn't do that, you know. So I guess in some ways, maybe that's a limitation, but I think it's important that an advertiser is like right in with your niche, though. Like,
so that actually leads to, if you think about the day-to-day and what it's required to run a podcast, how would you explain that to someone who maybe hasn't done this before?
It depends what you're trying to do. I mean, if you just want to record something very basic and just throw it up there, I mean, yeah, people do that, unfortunately, in my opinion, but they do it. I think it's important that you identify a need in an audience and don't produce something that is honestly quite, I don't want to say useless, but like there are shows like that. You tune in and you're like, what? Like, what's happening, right? Like, why am I here? It's like wandering into a room and like nothing's in order and there's a bunch of people there you don't know and you just end up kind of creeping out again and you don't go back, right? You know, it's a
great visual.
It is. I mean, that's how I feel when I get to a podcast like that. It's like, you know, you just kind of, you're in the middle of a conversation that makes no sense. You can always tell these kind of shows because they usually swear a lot too, and there's like one microphone in a room of 10 people and none of it's mixed properly, and I don't know. Anyways, I don't like shows like that, but I think that sometimes people ask me even like, oh, well, how could it possibly take a long time? I mean, it sounds like it doesn't take that much effort. It's just audio, right? It's like, well, I mean, anything that takes a lot of work and sounds really good sounds like it's easy. You know, like that's the point of playing an instrument to a high level too, is to make something very hard look very easy, you know? And so with the podcast, I mean, this one lady, I remember she said, look, I see you're asking for support on Patreon. She's like, I don't mean to be rude, but like, why would you need that? Like what? And I said, well, I mean, did you know this takes me 20, 30 hours a week if I'm not careful, you know? And hundreds of dollars a month. And it's a lot of effort. Like you need to be editing, show notes, recording, scheduling, dealing with bizarre website issues that crop up every 48 hours for no reason. Like there's so many steps and so much effort that goes into doing it well, you know? Yeah, it's a serious effort, you know? And like I said at the beginning, it doesn't really have to be that way, but like I wanted it to be that way. Like, I wanted a show for clarinetists that was edited properly and put out there. I didn't want just to kind of throw them up with no editing, and it detracts from it, you know? So, but yeah, it's a lot of day-to-day, week-to-week. And at the design talk, I remember talking about like trying to design your podcast so it fits into your life because that becomes an important element. You know, this may be a weird analogy, but it's kind of like getting a pet. I mean, all of a sudden you have to walk the dog. You have to feed the dog or it's going to die, you know? Like, if you don't feed your podcast, it's not going to go anywhere. So I guess it's kind of working it into your life in a way and spending the time and making it happen, which is hard, actually, especially some weeks.
So now it's been about 2-ish years that you've had the podcast out.
Yep.
Where do you see it going in the future?
Yeah, I'm kind of changing the concept right now. Like, I've done a lot of interviews, just straight up interviews, like, tell me about your childhood and, you know, all the way to whatever they do now. And I've since tried to do that less, and I know people want to tell their story, but it's time for a bit of a change. So this year, I'm going to try and make them more kind of answer-oriented. So, like, more for clarinetists who maybe don't want the interview style, but still want to learn about clarinet. So it's not going to be strictly educational, but for example, it might be something like, you know, today we're going to talk about injury prevention for musicians, and I might introduce the topic and why it's important, and then for 20 minutes, like, here's a specialist about this topic, and then it ends. So it's not going to be like, here's this person and tell me all of your life stories. It's going to be more focused and just as an experiment. Like, honestly, it's just something I want to try. Also, I'm experimenting with some new formats. I mean, one guest had this idea, a coming up episode, which is going to be really hard to edit. But he had this idea of, okay, well, it's his second time coming back on the podcast. I've asked him all the basic questions already. So I shouldn't say basic questions. There are no basic questions. They're all I do them all very structured and different. But he was like, well, hey, I have this duo, and we wanted to talk about arranging for my duo. Why don't you just kind of sit in virtually on a rehearsal, and we talk through stuff, and you can ask questions as they come up. And I was like, oh, this is an awesome idea. So I tuned in on Skype, and they chatted and warmed up and had a rehearsal and interacted, and I got to kind of, hey, wait a minute, why are you doing that kind of thing? And it's a different concept, and maybe not everyone will like it, but maybe new people will like it, and you don't have to listen to every episode. That's the other nice thing about a podcast. Like, you're not tied to the chair, forced to listen because you downloaded Clarinet. Like, if you don't like this episode or not interested in the guest or the topic, like, that's okay. I do that all the time with episodes of podcasts, especially when you get the same guest on 20 episodes, and then you're like, okay, well, I've heard this person talk before. I don't really need another one. But yeah, that's kind of the direction I would say, is I'm trying to change the format so it's more answer-oriented. Short story long,
Yeah, I like it. I think we should open up the floor. What questions do you guys have?
I guess I can go. Hi, I'm Sarah, and I was wondering, you mentioned previously that there was a need, or there is a need for a clarinet podcast, but what are the challenges that you face, if any, finding topics of conversation or people willing to talk about such a niche topic?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, but the problem is actually that there's too much. Like, people apply. I have a guest application form on the website, and I have literally dozens of people who apply, and so what they do is they come on the website, and if I invite them, I used to have it by invitation only, but I since opened it up because that's some interesting interviews come in that way. But so people can go in there, they click, they read my release form, they submit all their information, like their name, their bio, their topic. I even ask them what kind of mic they're going to use, and I get them to upload a picture, and then that goes to my show notes person and me. We make the website page from that. But anyways, they can just apply, and not everyone who applies that I accept, kind of thing. Like, I don't know, sometimes it's just like, well, I don't really know how to make a topic out of this, or maybe they're just a student or whatever. I don't mean just a student in a derogatory way, but maybe there's nothing to talk about yet, like maybe they haven't, like, just because you play the clarinet doesn't really make you a good guest. There has to be something that is interesting, and actually sometimes there is a student or something that's interesting, but just because you apply doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. And then I go through and kind of think about it, and sometimes that process is really long. Like, I've got such a backlog right now, it could be months before I get to someone who's in there, and sometimes I connect with someone at like 1 year, and then the next year it seems to be we connect, and it's just, there's almost too much to talk about. Yeah, like it sounds odd, but there's just so many different topics and people, and you have to be not afraid to have the same conversation with other guests too. Like, if you're talking about, I don't know, extended techniques or whatever, I mean, you could literally talk to every person again. You could have the whole show again with all those people, right? They would all have different perspectives. So yeah, if anything, it's a problem of narrowing it down to what it should be and who should be on. It's hard because, like, one of the guys was a student or just a recent graduate when he first contacted me, and it was what made me realize that it's important not just to talk to people who are at the end of not the end of their careers, but a long way into their careers, because sometimes the people offering the fresh perspective are the most interesting, and the people at the beginning of their careers, really, So like the guy I'm referring to, his name is Eric Salazar. I don't know if anyone listened to that episode with the Facebook, maybe not. But yeah, I mean, he was great. Like, he was like 22 years old or something at the time, and just kind of called me and was like, hey, I really want to be on the show. And I was like, all right, well, what do you do? Tell me about it, And he was in the music business, and I was like, okay, great, that sounds awesome, but, it's got to be new and neat.
Clarinet.
Claire nerd.
All right.
So I'm Halen. You went through most of the questions that I had in the first place, but I guess the only one that I would have that I think would be interesting is, how does it feel being on the other side of the mic, being the subject of the interview rather than the host asking the questions?
Like right now, you mean?
Yeah.
It's actually funny because I've done this before in the podcast, actually. Sometimes I like to, there's a whole like network of us that keep in touch in like music podcasting. We created like what they call a mastermind, and I'm actually chatting with them tonight a bit. But it's helpful. We check in every 2 weeks, and it's like, okay, like we sort of pool our knowledge and skills and work it out, and what challenges are you facing, kind of thing, and we work them out. And a long time ago, one of the things we decided was to kind of feature each other on each other's episode. And first of all, to try and sort of cross market, but also just to go behind the scenes a bit and interview the host. So like Jason Heath, who runs a Contrabass podcast, with it gets like 1 million downloads a year. It's a huge podcast, but we interviewed each other for each other's respective shows. So I was a host. I was a guest host on his show, and he guest hosted on mine and interviewed me. So. It's I don't know. I think it's just another conversation. I don't really think of it differently. In fact, my problem is I want to like start asking you questions.
And you can't.
And
You're
can't.
not allowed.
I'm not allowed. I had to sign something. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I just see it like a conversation. For me, I guess too, like with Clarinet, the concept is, although it is an interview show, it's also just like, I view it as kind of a conversation between clarinetists, right? So I'm not really, I am interviewing them, but it's almost as if like we went out for a beer to talk about the topic, like we just have a real conversation. I think that's not a reason people like it, actually. It's not just like, so tell me your childhood clarinet story. And then they do, and then it's like, okay, well now tell me where you went to school. It's, like people, I don't know if people want to listen to that, So I try and do a lot of research and identify like the things about the person that make them interesting and worthy of the conversation. And then we have a conversation. It's not really that's how I see it anyways. Maybe that helps me, but I imagine some people would face it differently or think about it differently, but I guess I just kind of don't. I don't know.
Well, it's also, I imagine, a bit of a passion project for you either way, right? Like you're doing this because you're passionate about clarinet. So whether you're asking questions to people or you're answering questions about it, it's coming from your interest in the topic,
yeah, we're just talking
not
about
necessarily seeing yourself in a specific role.
Yeah, I mean, there is some sort of, on that episode with Jason, he asked me similar questions actually about this, and I think I gave, honestly, probably a more insightful answer, but I but I mentioned a little more about how, like, to try and see it as what it is. If you're interviewing, you have to try and draw good questions out. You're not just good answers through good questions. You're not just going to sit there and talk like you're by yourself. Like you have to keep the audience in mind. I mean, whether or not you want to break that fourth wall or whatever they call it and address the audience, that's up to you. But they still are going to be there, And so you want to think about the structure and the shape of the show. But I don't want to let it detract too much from conversation. So I guess when I turn it around and it's turned on me, I try and just go with the flow and experience it and try and enjoy it and from that perspective. So
my name's Dan. A couple questions for you, kind of they tie in with each other. Why did you start when you started, like in December 2015? And then when did you kind of realize you had the potential to start what you did?
I don't know. It's a good question. I think that's when I had the idea. In December 2015, and I just decided to wait till the new year to launch it, so it would already be a year old. But I had the idea in probably December-ish 2015, and that's when I put together the pilot. Was December 2015, and I built the website. And actually, building the website without any content was one of the hardest things to do because it's like, well, what's going to be here? There's nothing, right? So the website was awful for the first little while. Well, you built up content because there's nothing to go there. It was just like my bio in the first pilot episode. It was kind of tough, but and then the second part of your question, like realizing the potential
of the podcast,
being able to do it, or
yeah.
what was it? I never really thought about that. I just did it. I didn't really think about whether or not I could do it. Honestly,
well, fair answer.
Yeah, I don't really think like that. If there's something that you want to do, like I don't know. It didn't seem like it would be that hard.
Did you think it would take off the way it did when you first started?
No, I didn't think it would be of wide interest like it has been. I really was just doing it out of self-interest, and I was just betting that there would be people who would listen too, But at the first, like especially at first, even if there was no one listening, I was still really enjoying it. And those episodes kind of are odd to listen to, but maybe it's because I wasn't thinking about anybody else at that point. They were more for me, and I was trying to kind of figure out how to market it to people who I didn't even know who they were. It was a tough thing, But you try and take things in bite-sized chunks. Like you can't worry about it all in one go. Like maybe today your problem is like, man, my interface isn't working or something. I mean, how do I record the audio? That was a big thing too. Like I didn't know. You had to learn all these things, right? So just chunk by chunk and just go through it until it kind of worked. I don't know.
My name is Ricardo Andres. And I was wondering, you were mentioning that people were listening to your podcast because you were relatable to them. And there's like, oh, maybe you can learn some things. But how has that, like having the podcast, how has that made your career flourish?
That's
or if it did?
It ruined my career. No, I'm just kidding. Oh my God. The opposite. No, it's been great. It's been great. Like I just connected with so many great people. I've made new friends. That's been the biggest thing. Is like I have people that I never would have realized even existed, let alone been like able to meet and talk to. And So I've met some new friends through the podcast. It got to the point where it, like even when I do local clinics and stuff, people recognize me as like the clarinet guy instead of just like another clinician coming in, like they expect that. But also like beyond that, like career-wise, I mean, yeah, I think it's increased, like for example, the marketability of my CD project, and so I think it built a lot of credibility and sort of demonstrated skill, like you don't put out 80 episodes of something and not know how to do it, So I think it just so much great networking and relationship building and in the industry. I think it's been really good in that sense. And yeah, it was surprising to me. I didn't expect that to go the way it did. But
That would add a bonus.
yeah, I mean, it definitely contributed, I think, a lot to what I'm doing. In some ways, I wish I could find a way to boost it more as far as like my playing goes. Like that's the one thing is I don't seem to be getting playing opportunities from it. It's not like someone calls me and is like, hey, I heard you run clarinet. Could you come sub in on our symphony for the weekend? I mean, that's not it's not really happening, right? But it's all the peripheral things that are going. And in some ways, I guess I've discovered that my interest in internet and marketing and everything is just as interesting as the clarinet. And so they sort of made myself a niche that way, I guess. So, I mean, you get pretty qualified when you know so much about so many different things. And clarinet is something which normally you don't know anything about those things. Like, why would someone who plays clarinet know about making a podcast? Like, it's not a normal skill set, like, but or running a website or something like that. But no, yeah, it's had a big impact, I think. I know it's your first question there was like redacted or something. It's classified.
It's off the record.
What was that one? I don't
It's
know.
off the record. It's off the record.
I'm nervous now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great.
I'm Kira, and my question is, does every single conversation or every single interview that you do turn into an episode, or have you had bad experiences where you haven't been able to turn an interview into an episode?
That's a really good question, because that's also something you can't foresee, right? Like the first time it happened, I went all the way to Montreal. I was there to see Radiohead, but I was also while I was there, I connected with someone who'd already been a guest on the podcast. Maybe I shouldn't say her name, but anyways, I connected with her there because the first time she came on the show, there was a bunch of listener questions, but I don't remember what happened. Like we either ran out of time or I screwed up or something. I forgot to include the listener questions in the episode, and after we got off the phone, I was like, oops, kind of thing. And so I said, look, I'm coming out to Montreal. You live there. Let's get together. And I just bought this microphone, and I hadn't properly tested it. And we went to a cafe, which was also a bad idea. Well, it was an okay idea. I mean, we had a good conversation, but it was just unusable. Like we had these teenagers beside us who were just screaming the whole time, and the chairs sliding around on the floor sounded like mini earthquakes, and I couldn't use it. It was useless. And unfortunately, I have since not been able to get in touch with her again, and it just didn't work. I don't think it looked great on me, and I don't think it looked great and people always requested, like, what happened to that interview? Finally, I just said, look, it's in the garbage. Like, I can't use it anymore. It's not okay. Like, it's a problem. I mean, I guess I could air it if you want, but it's not worth listening to, I mean, I thought about transcribing it into a blog post and just using it. But yeah, that was unfortunately a 2-part conversation too. It was long. It was like 80 minutes of conversation. So a really dumb thing was to not, learn how to use the microphone properly and check the levels and testing before I did it. Because I was in Montreal, like I'd flown across the country and sort of had like a chance to do this. So that was a really big screw up. And the second one was actually more recently. I've not used it. I had an appointment booked with somebody to talk. And the moment before we went on the call, I found out my grandmother died. And I still did the interview, which was probably a bad idea. And I listened back, and I was just like, oh, man, I was not really there for this. I was not thinking about it. And I just called the guy, and I was like, look, I mean, I know you talked to me for 45 minutes, but here's the circumstance. Like, I didn't do a very good job of this. I don't think I got the best answers out of you. I got frustrated a couple times when you weren't answering me the way I wanted. And, like, I don't want to air this. Can we start again? And he was nice. He called me back, and we had a second conversation. But I think that was an important thing because it wasn't good, and it's important to know, like, if it's not good, like, it shouldn't go out, And so although that was not the easiest thing to do, he was also a good guy, and it was just like, of course he wants to sound good and use understanding and all that, right? You know, I don't want to disappoint people either, but there's just times when, like, if 1,000 people are going to listen and it's not good, it's not what you wanted, like, maybe don't release it.
Yeah. No, I mean, quality control.
Yeah, quality control is what it comes down to.
For sure.
I mean, the content, for example, in the other episode I was talking about, the first one, content was probably great, but I don't know, it was so bad otherwise, it's just like, I don't know, I don't think it would have encouraged someone to continue listening if it was their first ever episode. Let's put it that way. So.
Okay, hello, I'm Grace. I'm not sure if you've talked about this, but I was wondering when you started to do the lightning round on your podcast, and what do you think it adds to it?
I honestly don't like the lightning round. I added it because it's a popular thing to do in podcasting. But I thought, I guess I started it around, I don't know. I was not that consistent with it when I started it. Like sometimes it was there, sometimes it wasn't. And then, you know, the consistency can be annoying, but it also can be important. Like people come to expect something at the end like that. So like I was doing it sometimes and not others, and people were like asking me about it like, wait, I listened to this whole episode and I was really hoping to hear so-and-so's lightning round and it didn't happen. Like, when's that coming out? Oh, it's not coming out. I didn't bother. Oh, that sucks, you know? So I took it out completely because I thought it was really tacky, honestly. But lots of people wrote me in like, oh, I really missed this. I wanted to hear what book this person was going to recommend and it's gone. Like, and then I tried making it only for Patreon backers. But then I started noticing because you talked about this the other day too, when you flip it around and start looking at it from another level, I realized there was some really good information coming out. So I rewrote the questions, I made them more clarinet-centric and more stuff that would be maybe generating an interesting response. And I now include it in almost every episode, unless the guest's been on before. Or I don't know if I'm going to do it as much going forward because this answer-based episodes may not accommodate it so well. But if it's an interview, like I always put it at the end now if there's time, because people really like to know the book suggestion of the person and otherwise. But I think the biggest benefit is just like a little piece of consistency because the rest of the show is not consistent in that way. Like it's not the same questions for every person. So people can come to expect this little thing at the end that's kind of, I don't know, feels safe, feels of interest, you know, to everyone.
Hi, my name is Chula,
Hey.
and I'm just wondering, how long does it take to produce an episode, and how much work do you put into it now compared to before you had an editor?
I mean, at the beginning, it depends how skillful you get at it, honestly. Like, so at the beginning, like when you're just fumbling through everything and you kind of don't know what you're doing, like you can spend 20, 30 hours on, I would anyways, kind of like really figuring it out, really getting it going, writing good show notes. Like, if it's an hour and a half long episode, every pass through is an hour and a half, you know, like, so to write the show notes takes at least an hour and a half. Editing is like 2-3 hours, booking the guest, having the interview, like, yeah, I would easily get to 10-20 hours at least.
Hello, I'm Nathan, and I was wondering, like, what are some of the challenges of going, like, outside of Calgary for sources and, like, recording maybe with people who are from different cities and different places?
It's just Skype. I record on Skype.
Okay.
Yeah, so I use a program called Audio Hijack, which allows you to take the Skype recording and your recording and put them on separate tracks, which makes editing really easy. Yeah, the time zones, I guess, are a challenge. I mean, one funny story is I remember twice this happened, actually. One time I was asleep, and I woke up, and I was like, oh, my God, what time is it? Like, wait a minute, what day is it? I realized I was supposed to be talking to this guy in London in like 5 minutes, and I hadn't even written the questions because I thought it was the next day. And I got this message from him. He was running late on the metro or something and was like, we're going to have to move it to another day. And I was like, oh, that's okay. That's okay. No big deal. And I was like, yes, you know. Yeah, nice. And another time, like, I actually lost the questions before the interview. But anyways, still went okay. But sometimes, like, these people are hours ahead or behind, you know. Like, if they're in Sweden, it's like, you know, it might be midnight for me and it's 10 a.m. for them, and it's just the way it is. So the time difference is kind of tough. Yeah, just scheduling the time difference is even more tough. I mean, there's applications that let you do it now. Like there's this thing called Calendly or something. It lets you like book times. That's been really convenient, although I don't tend to use it that much because it's an extra step. But it's that's true. I mean, everything that's 5 minutes is 5 minutes, right? I mean, times that by 50 things, and all of a sudden you're really into a lot of work, you know. Yeah, there's just other instances too where like it's been, I think it's 1 more hour, but it's gotten screwed up somehow. Or same for the guest, like, hey, where are you? Like, I'm here, let's do this, and they're somewhere else and literally a different time zone away, and we don't realize. So yeah, you have to be careful about that with the different time zones.
Is there anything we've missed? Anything you'd like to share, or anything else that you think we need to know?
It's so funny you say that because that's a big thing too. I often forget that like just because I talk to somebody doesn't mean I got what they came to me to talk about captured. Like some of the best answers come from that. Now that I've set it up that way.
I got nothing. I have nothing. Yeah.
I don't know. I guess no. I think we covered a lot of stuff, and I think if you want to check out, what it's like to podcast and things, you should try and reach out to some podcasters that are running podcasts you're interested in. As long as they're not like the Joe Rogan Experience or like Sam Harris or something gigantic, like you'll probably hear back from those people. I mean, one of the funny things about Clarinet too is like people write me messages, and when I reply, like they're really surprised that happens. I don't think they realize it's just a guy in his basement, So, but that runs both ways because like if you do it well and you're a small production, like also people are less likely to support it because like they don't see the reason to, right? Or at least I think that's one reason. But and also, some people really early on too were like applying for jobs. I'm like, I don't have jobs. I'm like I'm in my basement making a clarinet podcast. Like, there's not even really a job for me here. Let
me get a job first, please.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I guess that's where the interesting idea with the interns was to me is like, instead of making it about needing more money, it became about, I realized that the monetary need was actually a time need. And if people were listening and interested, it would be really cool, instead of feeling like it needs more money to run, to just spread out the time and let everyone not everyone be involved, but let people be involved in a meaningful way. And they're happy to do that, right? No, as far as like things I wanted to talk about, I think we covered pretty much everything. We got some technical stuff in there. We talked about like hosting the show and making the show, and I think it was good.
Awesome.
Of course, actually, check out my CD on Spotify. Yeah. When you go to sleep, just leave it playing constantly, right?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sean.
Thanks for having me. That was fun.
Show notes for today's episode can be found at clarinet.com/87. And while you're there, I invite you to check out ways that you can support the podcast directly. It's a huge help, and as a thank you, if you're a supporter on Patreon, you'll even get early access to high-resolution, ad-free episodes, a chance to ask listener questions, and a whole lot more. So check that out too. Click the support tab. And I want to remind you that the Clarinet Book Club, this month, the selection is The Inner Game of Music, which is something that I'm working my way through. I'm actually working my way through The Inner Game of Tennis as well, because I've been told by some people that it's actually in some ways even more interesting. So I'm hoping to have both of those books read by the end of the month here in order to discuss them on one of the upcoming book club episodes of the show. So if you haven't checked out that book yet, or you haven't thought about reading it, you still got a few weeks, and you can purchase any book for the book club, even if this is something you're listening to months or years later, at clarinet.com/books. I've got a list of them all there. So be sure to tune in over the next few weeks. There's some really great episodes coming out. One with Garrett Hack, who returns to talk about injuries for musicians, which it turns out around 76% of musicians will experience some sort of playing injury in their career that prevents them from playing. I believe it was for at least 2 weeks, which is just astounding. Also, Dr. Miranda George joins me on the podcast for a conversation about anxiety for musicians. And I'm joined by the Woodwire duo, who talks about what it's like to use a looper pedal and create their latest album, which they've actually sent me a few copies, which will be a fantastic giveaway for those on our email subscriber list. If you'd like to join that list, head to clarinet.com and enter your email address at the bottom of the page. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you also to the Clarinet production team, which is helping make the show possible every single week. And I'm your host, Sean Perrin, signing off from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I hope you'll join me again soon for more of what's new and neat for clarinet on the Clarinet Podcast.
Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is refining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with the world's most innovative techniques, so you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit D'Addario.com/woodwinds.